Hey there guys, it's Kyosika here with another Guild Wars 2 video. August is always a special month for Guild Wars 2 because it marks the anniversary of the game. In 2018, Guild Wars 2 celebrates its 6th birthday and a lot of things have changed over the course of 6 years. So, we're going to take a short look at the history of the game. And since the game is turning 6 years old, I want to cover 6 different features. Before we start, if you want to support my YouTube channel, make sure to watch this video all the way to the end, give it a like and share it with your guildies. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel as well. So let's have a look at 6 things that we do have now but we didn't have at the release of Guild Wars 2. Number 6, the looking for group panel. This might surprise you, but in its first year, Guild Wars 2 didn't have a looking for group tool. It's hard to even imagine the game without it. The Guild Wars 2 community heavily relies on it to basically do anything. Back in 2012, if you wanted to play a specific dungeon or meta event, you had to ask your guildies, friends, or other people in your map to play that specific bit of content. It wasn't all bad though. You really had to communicate with people to form your group, and usually this resulted in funny conversations which eventually led to new friends and you joining their guild. However, with the growing demand to do dungeons and meta events, it wouldn't take long before third-party websites rose up and did the job for the game. I had to ask a guildie because I completely forgot its name, but GW2 LFG was one of the most well-known Guild Wars 2 looking for group tools out there. As of today, the website is still live, but it doesn't list any groups. The website even had its own mobile app that allowed you to create and delete LFG listings. The concept of this website was rather simple. You put down your character name, your region, the type of content you wanted to play, and a short description. Then you just waited until people joined you in game. From what I remember, the tool worked really well and it immensely decreased the time to form a group. September 2013 marked the end of the GW2 LFG website. ArenaNet rolled out a beta version for an in-game looking for group tool. The tool is similar as the one we have in game right now, but it had fewer categories and it had some quirks that have been fixed now. The beta version of the LFG tool consisted out of 5 categories with subcategories. Now we have about 10 categories with tons of subcategories for very specific maps or types of content. Moving on to number 5. The Living World. Although the Living World came fairly short after the release of Guild Wars 2, I still think this is a topic worth covering, since it is such a big part of the game. It had some changes over the years and it is still running to this day. The Living World was the first bit of new content that players got after the release of Guild Wars 2. The exact starting date of the first season is kind of vague. I couldn't quite find the exact date, but I think it all started with the Halloween update in 2012. This was followed by the Lost Shores update in November 2012, which introduced us to the South Sun Cove. The first seasons were also a little bit controversial. As usual, you have people that like the content and you have people that don't like it. But most of the criticism was focused on the fact that most of the content was temporarily accessible. If you had a busy schedule or you couldn't log in for a period of time, well, then you won't be able to play it, ever. Take for example the Festival of the Four Winds and the Queen's Pavilion. They were made accessible in August of 2018, but before that they were inaccessible for about 4 years. Well, luckily this changed with the following seasons. Most of the content is replayable and you can visit the events and the maps at any time you want. In my opinion, the story also massively improved, and the story works up to the next expansion. And this brings me to the next topic on my list. Number 4, expansions. Take a look at any other MMO, World of Warcraft and even the original Guild Wars series for example. Both games have plenty of expansions. And as we know now, Guild Wars 2 has currently released 2 expansions. Well, this wasn't always the case. Guild Wars 2 was built on the idea to grow the world of Tyria solely with Living World updates. Back in 2013, Eurogamer interviewed now lead game designer Mike Soderashne about the future of Guild Wars 2. In this article, Mike said that there were currently no plans for an expansion and the idea was to maybe never release an expansion at all. I'll leave the Eurogamer article along with other articles about this in the description of this video. As a long-time Guild Wars 1 player, this didn't sit quite right with me. Guild Wars 1 released its first expansion, Guild Wars Factions, a year after its original release. The expansion had 2 new professions, hundreds of new skills and an entire new continent. So I was kind of worried about the upcoming content in Guild Wars 2. Luckily for me and other players, Guild Wars 2 released its first expansion in October of 2015. The first expansion was called Heart of Thorns and introduced us to a new profession, the Revenant. And this was all alongside elite specializations, new maps and a lot of new content. The expansion was well received and I was happy with the path ArenaNet was going. Right now, the Living World still plays a vital role between the expansions of the game. As I've stated before, it's a link between expansions in terms of story and gameplay mechanics. If I take a look at the wiki, Season 3 of the Living World lasted for about a year. from September 2016 until September 2017. The Living World Season 4 is about to end as well. This ran from November 2017 until September of 2018. Recently, the developers announced a new Living World update. This will be Season 5 of the Living World, and after this season we might hear something about the future expansion. So who knows? Maybe we'll get a new expansion announcement in 2019. Moving on to number 3, collections. You might not even notice it, but collections are a really big part of the game. Collections are both accessible for free-to-play players and players that have bought any of the expansions. Back at the release there were no collections available and weren't released until September 2014. There's currently a really game-changing set of collections in the game. These collections allow the player to create a precursor weapon for a legendary weapon. If you wanted a legendary weapon before these collections, you either had to be in luck and get it dropped from a chest or a random monster, or you had to have a lot of money to buy the precursor weapon from the trading post. Currently, you can get a precursor weapon by doing a collection which consists out of performing certain tasks and crafting a few items. In contrast to the first generation of legendary weapons, for example Sunrise and Bifrost, the more recent legendary weapons, trinkets and rings all require you to do a collection. So we see that the game's developers are creating mandatory collections to craft a legendary weapon. One thing I particularly like about collections is that they allow the player to get ascended weapons and some ascended armor with relative ease. For example, the Heart of Thorns and the Path of Fire Elite Specialization collections. Sure, they require some effort, but you can get a unique ascended weapon and this will allow you to quickly gear up your character. Number 2. Megaservers and features of convenience. I remember back in 2011 and early 2012 that me and my Guild Wars 1 buddies were thinking about which world we were going to play on when Guild Wars 2 was released. So we made some sort of agreement that this was going to be the Far Shiver Peaks world. If we didn't discuss this beforehand and someone chose another world, then we wouldn't be able to play with each other. That's strange, right? Well, before 2014 this was somewhat the reality. Luckily, you could use the guesting feature and you were still able to play with your friends. But the older system had some quirks. For example, players that played on a larger world could find themselves in a so-called overflow map and not be able to play with their friends. The map they were trying to access was full and they were put into another instance of that map unable to play with their friends. In contrast, players that played on a low populated server could find the map mostly empty with barely anyone to play with. Luckily, in 2014, the game's developers created Megaservers. This meant that players were no longer segregated from other players and the game massively increased the chance that you were put into the same map as your guild members, friends and players that spoke the same language. The Megaserver system also allowed players to always play on well-populated maps and therefore they could easily play group content together. Over the many years, some other small quality of life features were added to the game. For example, the ability to open all bags or consume all items at once. I couldn't quite find when it was implemented into the game, but I remember to be very happy with it since it makes cleaning up your inventory a lot easier. And just recently, the novelty system was added. This allowed you to consume your gizmos and other items you've collected over the years and put them in a separate tab in your hero panel. This feature alone cleared up a lot of my storage space. If you know any other quality of life features that were put into the game after the release of Guild Wars 2, put it in the comments. Alright, let's move on to the last feature on this list, and that is number 1, endgame content. This might sound strange, but in my opinion, Guild Wars 2 didn't have any endgame content at its release. There wasn't much hardcore endgame content, and coming from Guild Wars 1, which mainly consisted out of hardcore endgame content, it was a bit hard to get used to Guild Wars 2. I remember hitting level 80 rather soon, and I just did dungeons, leveled alts, and did the meta events in ore. I had fun and all, but I felt something was missing. Just a few months after the release, around November of 2012, ArenaNet released the first Fractals of the Mists. I remember me and my guild played through the first 50 fractals as fast as possible. This also marked the introduction of the Ascended armor, and this was quite exciting to obtain my first set of that armor. Anyway, fractals and all were cool, but raids really filled the gap I was missing. In some ways, it closely resembles the Fissure of Woe and the Underworld in Guild Wars 1. This was really the endgame content I was looking for in Guild Wars 2. When they first released the raids, I remember spending every evening with my guild trying to beat the Veil Guardian. I think we defeated it after a week or so. The excitement that my team had after beating it is something I remember fondly to this day. Right now we have 5 raid wings into the game and we'll probably have a new one soonish. Also, the living story might introduce us to some new piece of endgame content. The Sun's Refuge, for for example, but that is all speculation for now. If you sticked around till the end, thank you so much for watching, and this wraps up my list and this video. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe for more Guild Wars 2 content, and if you want to help my channel grow, don't forget to share this video with your guildies. Thank you so much for watching, and peace.